Welcome! In this video, we're going to review the Akado Raiju Katana. I don't expect this sort of video to be regular, but I was super excited for specifically this sword for a couple months. But I want to kind of, because I think it's worth it, right? So the idea behind this particular sword is you should be able to both use it in a form, right? So like in a kata or in a gumbo or something like that, as well as in sparring and application. Now, so this is very similar to those of you who do practice HEMA. This is essentially a HEMA style katana, right? Now, there are others like that. So the Castile is an example of a similar sword that does the same sort of thing. But this particular sword makes me very happy because there's obviously an actual beautiful scabbard for us to kind of be working with, as well as the ability to actually strike this against another like sword. So let's take a look, right? So I'll show you how it came to me, and we can actually start to use this and discuss. Very quickly, y'all are going to figure out I really am just a dude with a camera. So this is the casing for the Raiju Katana from Akado, giving you a little bit of a close-up. Ignore that part, but a little bit of a close-up. Kind of see, what's what. So again, it is a wooden box with a fabric covering with a screen paint on top, as well as paper below. But I want to do this relatively quickly. If there are any critiques, I'll kind of probably say them at the end. Now, I have used the sword before for the past week for a couple classes, but so this is not exactly as it was presented, but this is the cover that we have for the sword, as well as the rubber tip that you can add to the sword for a little bit extra safety when you're sparring. One thing to note, just because it's different, not to say good or bad, but like the fabric is very like soft compared to the ones, almost like a microfiber kind of feel. Those are a little bit different compared to the standard like kind of raw-ish cotton or silk they usually get. And now the actually important part, right? So this is the Raiju Katana. So again, I will say, very gorgeous, right? So I like a little bit more of a simple kind of sword design. So this is the simpler of the two versions that they have. The other one is a little bit of a bright red. Notice that I got the ruggedization upgrade. So these guys are usually bamboo, right? So usually bamboo also with standard katana, but these are brass. The Tsukaito has some epoxy on it to make it a little more rugged. So just keep those things in mind as you're doing. I was highly recommended to do it by people who own a sword like this. This knot is obviously going to be going away soon because I'm going to actually be using this for sword practice and stuff like that. So that will be gone. But this is essentially what we're looking at right now. So again, nice fixtures, all of that fun stuff. So as compared to, for example, the Castile, which is very simplistic, this has a little bit more oomph to all the pieces. And then the actual sword, right? So you already saw all of that, right? So notice that there is no brass coupling, right? So brass collar there, and notice that's where kind of like divot starts. You kind of move all the way down the blade. Noticing the divot ends around there. That is just a smear of oil. That's not rust, don't worry. But that is the shape of the tip, right? Noticing it's not like sharp or anything like that. One thing I do recommend, so obviously with all steel swords, and iron obviously, but I like to oil my swords, and I highly recommend for this one, especially if you are going to be doing some kata practice, right? Just because without it's a little bit of a drier put away. One thing to note, like although there is no copper piece there, the seal is still pretty tight. So if you're worried about that, don't be, at least for the first couple weeks. I've only had this for about a week, but we're gonna give you upgrades or updates as they happen. Now, one thing I'll note, only because I really am a goblin, right? So like, if I was gifted a box like this, I am going to use it until it physically breaks on me. So things to note, now this is just an extra thing. Like, obviously I didn't request this box or anything like that, so it was just an extra on top of having an already lovely sword. But something to consider. So yes, wooden box with a cloth kind of underneath, with the screen painting. So one thing to note is, so for example, the painting does come off, or the screen printing, not painting, does come off. So for example, there's a sticker there that kind of designated what type of sword that was. With the removal of the sticker, also off came the printing. And one thing to note as well is when they're shipping it, they wrapped a bubble wrap around either end, taping it to the bottom. And because the bottom is in fact paper, it is probably going to tear. Now that said, most people probably aren't going to like pay too much attention to all this stuff, but for my fellow goblins out there, just keep that in mind. So, how are we going to review a sword, right? So, I've already used this sword for 2 very, very quick sessions, one class and one just for my own sake. Neither of us were sparring, so this has not been hit in any way, and I literally just got the Sageo done up like this today, right? So we haven't done that, the proper like draw and put away just yet, and we're going to do that kind of live, right? But the 4 major criteria that I'm going to be using are going to be balance. I'm going to be kind of vague with that, and you'll kind of see what I mean in a bit. But balance, comfort, feedback, and then if I just like a sword or not, right? So let's just dive right into that. So balance, right? So one thing to note is going to be that the space between the note, right, the note here and the end is a little bit small for my hand, right? Now, can you put your palm over the notch here? Sure, that's absolutely fine, right? I'm just used to it's a little bit more of a gap here, so I can have a little bit more free reign with my Sageo, right? Not Sageo, Saya, right? But again, noticing, don't do this with your own sword, but although there is no brass fitting in there, it's sealed, right? So if you're used to doing that, in fact, you should have a good practice of doing that. If you're doing a Korean or Japanese style, there is that full seal there, right? But even just doing some basic draws, the balance, and this is also true from when I was doing forms earlier, and also do some forms later in this video as well, the balance is beautiful, right? So the idea with this one, like even as we're doing some basic swings, right, even some one-handed stuff, kind of get some good vibes out of it, is very well balanced. And again, as I'm going to do with some forms, it's going to just be a very nice sword to be using, right? One other aspect of balance, which really isn't quite balanced, is just the sheer mass of the sword. So if you're looking for a sword that feels like a cutter, right, so something that's intended for cutting bamboo or something like that, this is a little bit more hilt-centric than a bamboo cutter sword. So if you're used to having a little bit more mass at the front in order to get a little more power, you're just not going to have that as much. But if you're looking for something a little more dexterous, right, so like just doing like simple like figure eights, right, or if you're doing just a kind of like quick like Mizani strikes, for example, that's a sword for you, right? But in terms of balance and all the fun stuff, very, very good, highly recommend. Comfort is a weird thing, right? So a comfortable sword doesn't necessarily mean that the sword is good or bad. So an uncomfortable sword, likewise, is not a good or bad sword. So that just means the sword is not, you're not used to the weight of the sword or the way the sword moves. And that just might be a you thing as opposed to a sword thing. That said, usually a lot more cheap swords, you kind of feel the weird wonkiness with the sword, especially if they're not like full tang, for example. However, in general, the comfort is pretty much there with this sword. One thing to note, the hilt is pretty standard. It is a more circular than oval. So my other sword, which I believe is a Paul Chen, is more oval, but it's intended to be essentially a cutter, so a bamboo cutter. However, this is still a pretty standard grip on it, right? So if you're used to doing Iaido work, for example, this is going to feel very, very comfortable, right? Very, very familiar at the very least. And the curvature of the sword is also pretty standard, right? There's nothing, it's not like a very, very curved sword that kind of makes the angle alignment a little bit more difficult. This is a pretty standard curve to the sword, right? So if you're used to like kind of just picking up off the street and swinging around, that's probably about the same curvature that we're dealing with here. That said, the hilt is, again, longer than the standard katana, right? Again, that's probably to accommodate people using gloves and gauntlets when we're doing this for sparring. Noting that that doesn't apply to this either. So this is a kind of like a standard width here, so it will be very hard for you to be drawing using a glove. But the hilt adds a little bit of balance to it. So if you're not used to a longer hilt, it might be a little bit weird, especially when we're doing one-handed draws and stuff like that. It might catch on your sleeve occasionally, but that is just something that you can learn through practice. And one thing to note that's going to help with the comfort as well is making sure that the sword is oiled, right? Now obviously oil it, probably wipe off the oil before you practice, but having that very thin veneer of oil does help with the drawing and the putting away of the sword. It made a huge difference between the first time I used the sword and the second time I used the sword. When I oiled in between, it was a much nicer experience after it was oiled. For feedback, really the main thing is going to be whether or not it has a blood groove. This does not have a blood groove, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. So the reason, at least my guess as to the reason why there is no blood groove, again, the blood groove is kind of what makes that nice whistling noise if you have good cutting alignment, right? It's not really a blood groove, but we're not going into that. Is that if they did have that groove in there, it would probably make the sword even harder to flex when you're stabbing, right? So when you're sparring and you thrust at someone, for safety's sake, you do want the sword to be able to flex a little bit at least, so it dissipates some of the energy as opposed to going straight into whatever's being stabbed. So if there were to be a blood groove, I think that would make it a lot more difficult. So the fact that there isn't one on here, although you can't hear it in a gum butt, you can still use it and can probably still feel if it's not aligned. So what I'd recommend is, as a very, very first sword, maybe not if you're trying to learn cutting alignment, even just picking up essentially like a cheap iron sword will give you a lot of feedback there. But if you know what you're doing already, this is going to be a pretty good sword. I'm going to hold off on the fourth criteria until I do a few more forms in front of you guys, just so you have a sense of how the sword moves, right? So a few forms just to kind of instantiate kind of what the sword probably does best, right? I'm going to do a form called Sangsu 3, which is a lot more about that two-handed kind of just strike, strike, strike kind of scenario. Again, this is not intended to be me demonstrating a form well. It's just kind of using the sword in a fairly familiar way, get a good vibe for it, right? I'll kind of talk my way through it as well. So again, the balance is quite nice, right? And if I really want to like pressure, for example, here using the hilt and the balance, so pretty good. Yeah, it's a very, not very, at least compared to my other steel sword, there is more mass in the hilt, making it easier to have like those flicking motions, right? Or at least the twisting motions here. Especially with our switch to reverse grip, that's probably one of the easiest ones to do because it does depend on a little bit of that to move it along. So again, I already used that word during the form, but it's a very balanced sword. Again, really good for like dexterous work as opposed to raw power. In terms of one-handed stuff, right? In fact, although the hilt is pretty long, it's, again, balanced enough near the hilt that the use of it for reverse grip is actually pretty nice. right? Because then you can have a lot more of the twisting motion here. And if you have any flourishes, again, it makes that nice and easy. So one-handed, also pretty good. Standard Yaido, right? So it does feel a little bit silly because the hilt's so long, because the guard is supposed to be in the center, at least in the style that I practiced, right? It's just way over here, which is mildly amusing to me, right? But the main thing with this one is the Sayabiki, right? Again, my tip should be a little bit lower. That's me making the noise, not the sword. And very smooth put away. Not because of me, but because the sword's geometry is balanced and shaped in such a way that's pretty good use for Yaido practice. Specifically, if you're looking for like, this is a very, very specific thing, but starting upright, and as you're drawing, you're twisting it, and using that Sayabiki, you get a little more oomph. Same thing as you're putting the sword away. Again, using, starting off horizontal, and twisting it up. Again, very, very smooth. That's also a lot of good work on the scabbard. So the scabbard is also very top-notch. And then the things that aren't really in forms, but they're just fun, unless if you're like in XMA or something. But just doing some fancy, more dexterous sort of things here. Bop. Right. Again, because of the weight distribution, it is pretty good for this sort of thing as well. It's a very flashy, good use, would be a good use for that as well. So again, this has only been 1 week, so I'm hoping to, again, make another video after I've used this in a few sparring matches, so we kind of see how well it's so sheathed and a lot of fun stuff after it has a few dings in it, right? But again, in terms of balance, again, that's probably it's one of its best attributes is the balance of the sword. Again, it's not top. It's not. I wouldn't even say top heavy is a good way to describe a bamboo cutter sword. But again, the weight distribution is a lot closer to the hilt than the tip, right? For me, pretty comfortable, right? The only thing to probably note is because of the longer hilt, if you are using like shorter sleeves, or you might even like accidentally brush your forearm, for example, when you're drawing, that's just one thing to consider. But overall, again, the comfort of it, the natural curve of the sword makes it very ergonomic and efficient, right? The feedback on it, again, you don't hear anything. And because of the balance, it doesn't give you as much of feedback if you get something wrong. Like if you're really twisting the blade or you're overextending late, because it's so balanced, it kind of counteracts that by kind of a lot. So in that regard, I recommend this for someone who already has some decent experience and kind of knows when they're doing something weirdly, and they don't need the sword to tell them that necessarily. But the fourth criteria, right? So the fourth criteria is whether or not I even like the sword. And I like it, right? So this is just the least scientific kind of thing, is like, do you just like a thing? I like the thing, right? So the idea of it just is so nice, right? So being able to use this literally for as much as you, I was going to say literally everything. I caught myself halfway, like, well, we can't use it for some things. But being able to use it for forms, being able to use it in just demonstrating technique against someone who might be doing a form, or taking it out of context and just demonstrating for a student, right? Using it in sparring, being able to do all of these things with a single, item, a single weapon is phenomenal, right? So if this sword kind of like lives up to the reputation it has in my mind, again, this is not saying anything that they've proclaimed, right? But frankly, like if it gets, if it's able to handle all those aspects, I might kind of want all my students to have one. It'd be a good thing. But yeah, so I'm going to keep you guys updated, right? So this has only been 1 week. Let's kind of go through this journey together. So we'll see just how well this works out. But again, with that, make sure you stay safe, stay humble, and keep training.